like I said, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7. You might want to go ahead and open up there. Last week, one of the things we talked about was Jesus, and we looked at, well, of course, we talk about Jesus every week now because we're in this series, but we looked at how 100 years ago, there was something that began to happen. A debate started to rage in churches where people began to say Jesus was not really deity, but he was still a wise and moral teacher. And so we should pay attention to his teaching, but we should not buy into this idea that he lived a sinless life and that he rose from the dead. There were people who actually taught that, and they really stressed the teaching ministry of Jesus. And there were other people who rose up in response to that and said, no, Jesus was and is God in a body. He was deity incarnate. He is the second member of the Godhead. He is equal in status with the Father and with the Spirit. And he lived a sinless life. He was born of the Virgin Mary, and he died a sacrificial death. He rose victorious from the grave. And unfortunately, one of the negative things that happened, it was a very good thing that they responded, but one of the negative things that happened is the teaching ministry of Jesus in conservative churches began to be de-emphasized. And as students and disciples of Jesus, we neglect his teaching at our peril, really, because one of the things that we also talked about last week is that when people first signed on to follow Jesus, they weren't trying to get into heaven necessarily. They didn't understand things that way, and they didn't understand who he was all of the time. What they did know was they'd never heard anybody teach like that. They'd never seen anybody live like that. They'd never thought the way he thought, and they found out that they could trust him as a teacher, that he knew what he was talking about. And it was largely because they came to trust him as their teacher that after he died and rose again and appeared to the multitudes and then ascended to his Father and poured out his Spirit, then they were able to trust him as their Savior because they had first trusted him as their teacher. And in their minds, there was no way to separate the idea of trusting Jesus as your Savior but not trusting him as your teacher. That just was something that would never have occurred to them. So one of the statements that we made last week is the statement, Jesus is Lord, doesn't mean a lot if you can't also say Jesus is smarter than I am and Jesus is my teacher. So all of that to set up kind of where we're going to go tonight. And one more word about Jesus' teaching before we really dive into the text here. I want to deal with what he was after when he taught, what his purpose was. Because Mark chapter 7 really sort of deals with what his teaching is and what his teaching is not. Now, to set that up, I want you to think back to when you were 15 or 16 years old. Because for some of you, that'll be very easy to remember. For some of you, you just as soon forget it. But when you think back to when you were 15 or 16 years old, there's a book, one book that every 15 or 16-year-old has to familiarize themselves with, has to be able, in fact, to quote certain passages from this book. It becomes the most important book in your life when you're about 15 or 16 years old, and no other book takes precedent over it. Anybody want to guess what that book is? That's right. In California, it's called Rules of the Road. I don't know if they had that here in Georgia, but in California, when I turned 16, Rules of the Road was the most important book on the face of the earth. And you have to learn this book. You have to be able to memorize it. You have to be able to quote it. And you have to be able to pass a test over it. Now, Rules of the Road, you understand, it contains rules of the road. It contains laws that deal with certain circumstances. So you wonder, okay, what happens if I come to a four-way stop and all four of us stop at the same time? What do we do? You know, or if I come to an intersection and the traffic signal is out, how do I know what's a safe following distance? What are those kinds of circumstantial laws and rules? And that becomes very, very important. Now, Rules of the Road is not aimed at the heart. It's not concerned with how you feel about the rules or about the other drivers. You will never get a ticket and get pulled over by the policeman, and the policeman will say, well, I know you were driving below the speed limit, but I noticed you resented the speed limit. No one will ever give you a ticket for being proud of how much better you know the rules than all the other people. Or, I noticed that you weren't demonstrating love for your fellow drivers, and so I'm going to charge you with vehicular self-righteousness. Nobody ever... No, because nobody cares how you feel about the rules of the road. They just care that you obey the rules of the road. So the book, Rules of the Road, that's all it's concerned with, is transferring information and so that your behavior will conform to these rules. Now, the problem is, a lot of people read the Bible as if it were rules of the road. They go to the Bible and think this is sort of rules for the road of life. What do I do when I'm at a four-way stop? I open up the book and I figure out what are the laws. What do I do when my wife and I are in an argument? I open up the book and I read the rules to see what I'm supposed to do. How do I behave in church? I go to the book to see the way I'm supposed to behave. And we read the Bible as if it were only concerned with transferring information so that your behavior will conform to a certain standard. And I'm here to tell you, the Bible is not rules for the road of life. It doesn't work like that, especially with Jesus' teachings. The Bible is not like that. Jesus' teaching, for the most part, comes down to this. Here's what it looks like in God's kingdom. Here's what life in God's kingdom is like. And you'll drive yourself nuts if you go through Jesus' teaching and look for rules and laws. It's not like Jesus came to say, all right, your problem is you just don't have the right rules. You need to substitute your set of rules for a new set of rules. That's not what Jesus was saying at all. Jesus says, I'm coming after something much deeper than just that. I'm after transformation and authenticity, not just behavior modification. And let me just say this. There are some people in this room right now, and you're really, really nervous about this idea. And that's okay. Because this idea has made people nervous since the very, very beginning. And that's what we find here in Mark chapter 7. If you open up to Mark chapter 7, and I don't have this on the overhead, but if you just look at the first verse, I want somebody to look at the first verse and tell me who the audience is. Who's the audience in Mark chapter 7? Pharisees and scribes or teachers of the law. Pharisees and teachers of the law, and their main objective was to demonstrate how well they knew the rules of the road. That was their whole purpose, was to show people, I know the rules of the road better than you know the rules of the road. Look how meticulous I observe the Sabbath laws. I am a more righteous driver than you are. Look how meticulously I observe all the dietary laws and how you must wash your hands with one eggshell full of water down and then one eggshell full of water the other way. I can quote all 613 laws from memory. I must be a more righteous person than you lowly people are. That was their whole objective. That was their main goal in life, was to demonstrate to people that they knew the laws better than everybody else. They were more informed than they were. But their primary problem was that while they were meticulously observing all these laws, there began to creep into their hearts ugly things, dirty things, sinful things like pride and arrogance and self-righteousness. And Jesus' main objective was to come and counter that, not to inform them and not to get them to conform to a set of standards, but to transform them from within. Because when you get hung up on somebody's behavior, you can get a lot of false positives. And we talk about this in the parenting book, that for parents especially, when you're so fixated on your kid's behavior, you can think, my kid is pretty good. Look at them. They go to school and they get good grades and they go to church and they know their memory verse. But what happens a lot of times is they only obey until no one's looking. And then they go off to college and they go crazy because you've not touched who they are on the inside. You can have a person who looks really good on the outside. They know all the right things, and from external appearances, they do all the right things, but on the inside, there's nothing. There's no core, there's no substance, there's nothing but a show. And Jesus calls these people hypocrites. They're acting, but it's not authentic. And Jesus says, I'm coming after your hearts because I really believe that if I can get your heart right, your behavior will adjust itself on its own. And it'll come from a place of authenticity. I was doing a men's retreat a couple of years ago. I may have told this story in here before, but we were doing this men's retreat, and some people came to this men's retreat. A dad brought his son. His son was like 19 or 20 years old, and his son had just gotten out of prison and had come to faith while he was in prison. So he goes to prison, he becomes a Christian, but he's a very novice Christian. Now he comes to this men's retreat, he's out of prison, and he's very rough around the edges, you know. And we're breaking out into small groups, and we're praying together, and this guy volunteers to pray. But he warns everybody, I've never done this out loud before, is that okay? So we say, absolutely not, get out of here. Go back. No, we didn't do that. We said, of course you can. So he starts to pray, and in the course of his prayer, he starts using words that you're not supposed to use. He's using words that you wouldn't say like in mixed company or something like that, and he's using them right out loud to God, and we're getting nervous. And one of the things that I thought of was, I've used those words before, but never to God. And then I thought, like he didn't hear them, you know? And this is what I really believe. God favors that kind of prayer over somebody who knows all the words and all the phrases, and it sounds perfect, and all those authorized, guide, guard, and direct, bring us back to the next point in time, bless the nourishment of our bodies, may we do this in a manner well-pleasing in thy sight, in Jesus' name. All those things, you can know all those phrases and say them all and look good and sound like you know what you're doing, and they don't come from a heart of integrity. And God favors this guy's prayer, laced with profanity and bad language, more than our beautiful, flowery prayers, because Jesus says, I'm after your heart. And if I can get your heart right, we can deal with behavior later. But if you just deal with behavior, you can get a lot of false positives. Okay, Jesus says, I'm not bringing a new set of rules. I'm bringing a new way of living, a totally different way of living. And Jesus is, in describing this, he says that the problem in his day was very similar to the problem that Isaiah faced in his time. And I would suggest that it's very similar to the same problems that we face today. People sometimes take religion very, very seriously, but they miss the entire essence of what God is after, what is essential to what God's after. And that's what Jesus is trying to correct here. So, Mark chapter 7, look down at verse 6. Jesus says, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. God is not primarily about rules. God is primarily about relationships. Now, in the context of relationships, there may be rules and boundaries and borders and those kinds of things, but first things first. God is not primarily concerned with how meticulously you keep the rules. God is primarily concerned with your heart and its relationship with Him. And in the context of that relationship, God then begins to influence, not coerce, not manipulate, not force, but influence and shape your heart and your character. And from a right heart and from a solid character flows right behavior. You become a new kind of person, and a new kind of person lives a new kind of life. And Jesus goes on to say over the course of the next 3 years of his teaching ministry that one of the primary characteristics of this new kind of life is truth. A life characterized by truth. Now, the word that we translate truth in the New Testament comes from a Greek word. The Greek word is aletheia. And aletheia can be translated a lot of different ways, but one of the best ways to translate it is divine reality, or reality from God's perspective. The way things are from God's perspective. Now, I'll admit, I am not God. I know that comes as a shock. No, that doesn't come as a shock to anybody. I'm not God. So I don't see things the way God sees them. So I can never absolutely grasp truth, because I'll never be able to see things from God's perspective. I am constantly going to live the rest of my existence, not just the rest of my life here on earth, but on through eternity, trying to grasp more of God's truth. But I'll never come to the point where I see things from God's perspective absolutely. But our lives should be increasingly characterized by truth, lived as if we understand what things really are like from God's perspective. In fact, one of my favorite definitions of the word wisdom comes from a Bible teacher that I had when I was in college named Knofel Staton. And Knofel used to say that wisdom is the God-given ability to see the true nature of things. And Jesus, when he came, very rarely said, do this, don't do that. Here's a list of 5 rules that I want you to obey and 7 things I want you to avoid. More often than not, Jesus said, here's the way things are. And he trusted that if you really understood the way things are, you'd adjust your life accordingly. If I told you, don't run through this wall because it's solid, I wouldn't even have to tell you, don't run through this wall. I'd just say, this wall is really solid. And I wouldn't have to tell you, don't run into it, don't hit it with your fist, I would just trust that you would figure that out on your own, you see? So Jesus comes along and he says, this is the way life is. This is the way the kingdom of God is. This is what God is like. This is what people are like. This is what relationships are supposed to be like. And he trusts that you're going to adjust your behavior accordingly if you understand reality from God's perspective. So when it'll change the way you read the Bible if you substitute, anytime you come to the word truth, if you substitute that with the word reality. For example, when you get to John chapter 8, verse 32, and it's a familiar verse, we all know it. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What happens if you substitute? You'll know the divine reality, or you'll know the way things are from God's perspective, and that truth will set you free. A lot of people get tripped up by this verse. What does it mean that truth sets you free? Well, a good way to think about it is, remember when you were a little kid, and there would be a monster you'd see a shadow or something like that, and you'd think there was a monster in your bedroom or in your closet or under your bed or something like that, and you'd freak out. And at some point in time, you grow up and you learn, oh, that's not really, or maybe your parents come in and they show you, that's not really a monster, that's the street light shining through your window and it makes a shadow and that reflects on your mirror, and they point all that stuff out to you, and all of a sudden now you see reality. You see what the reality is, and it frees you up from all that fear that kept you from sleeping well when you were a child. Sometimes the truth, or just understanding reality, sets you free. And so truth is reality in God's kingdom. And Jesus had a lot to say about how his followers should handle the truth. For example, in Matthew chapter 5, go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, and you'll see this for yourself. Matthew chapter 5, we'll begin in verse 33. Matthew 5, 33. He says, "You've heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot," apparently this was a problem for them, "for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Now, Sometimes, if a child doubts the veracity of what you're saying, they will ask for some assurance that what you're saying is actually true. And typically, that comes in the form of a question, sometimes a one-word question. Promise? Do you promise? That's what they want to know, because for a child, the idea that you would violate a promise is unthinkable. So you can mess around, you can play around, you can tease, you can pretend all you want, but when a kid comes out with that, do you promise, then all the teasing stops, and what comes now is the truth. Kids understand that if you say, I promise, that must be the truth, okay? Now, when a kid wants you to trust them, frequently they'll volunteer that. They won't wait for you to ask them, do you promise? They'll say, I promise. They'll say, I promise, I really promise. And if that doesn't work, if you still look kind of skeptical, then they start adding darker elements to it, don't they? I promise, cross my heart, hope to die. This is serious business now. I'm hoping to die now. If that still doesn't work, they go one step further, don't they? Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. That's gross. I mean, I suppose the thinking goes like this, well, I'm already dead, so who cares if you stick a needle in my eye? I mean, dead people, I've already wished to die, so dead people don't care where you stick needles. You can stick a needle in my foot. It doesn't matter, but stick a needle in my eye. I mean, this gets serious business now. Kids know when you say that, now you have to be serious. And when you grow up, we have our own version of cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye, don't we? You go into a court of law, and what do? You put your hand on the Bible, and you raise your right hand, and you say, I swear. You swear an oath. Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. There's no getting around that now. You've said it 3 different ways, and you said it with your hand on a Bible. So they make you swear an oath. Anybody ever bought a house? Oh, I've had physicals that were less invasive than that. I mean, it's crazy. You got to give them a pound of flesh and a pint of blood and your firstborn child and your parents' kidneys, and you got to do all kinds of stuff. You got to sign your name 37 times and pay for an entire fleet of lawyers and notary publics to sit around and make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. They make you pay for all of that. Why? Why do you have to put your hand on a Bible and say it 3 different ways? Why do you have to have attorneys present and sign your name 45 different and pay sometimes? You got to pay insurance that says I really am going to make my mortgage payment. Why do you have to do that? Why? Because they don't trust you. You know why they don't trust you? Because people lie. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. People lie. John Ortberg is a preacher out in California, and he told a story not too long ago about being in a car, and he had his kids in the back seat, and this was when his kids were a little bit younger. His wife was in the passenger seat. His 3 kids are in the back seat, and he knew with a relative amount of certainty that one of his children had done something. He didn't have like a smoking gun or anything like that, but he pretty much knew. So he's kind of cross-examining the 3 kids, like Perry Mason used to, and trying to get them to, trip them up in their stories and things like that. And finally, one of the kids in the back seat realized what she was being accused of. And she looked at her dad, big brown eyes, trembling chin. Daddy, you don't think I would lie, do you? And he said, I started to say, oh no, of course not. But I caught myself. And I thought about it. And I said, of course I do. Of course I think you would lie. Everybody lies. I lie. Your mom certainly lies. Everybody lies. Everybody I've ever known lies. It's true. Everybody, mass confession time, all right? Anybody who has ever been late to something and you blame traffic on 400 when it was just the fact that you did. Anybody who ever cheated on a test. Anybody who ever claimed not to know how fast you were going. Anybody who ever told the kids that it was after 8 o'clock when you knew it was not after 8 o'clock at night. Anybody who has ever deceived anyone at any time, raise your hands, mass confession time, I did it. All right, so that's everybody. Everybody lies. Now, kids, when they get older, and they get kind of past all the cross my heart, hope that I stick a needle in my eye thing, they get a little more sophisticated, don't they? Kids get sophisticated. And suppose I want to tell a lie, but I want to maintain credibility with the other person. There's a whole system for that, isn't there? What is it? Cross your fingers. Hide it behind your back. Everybody knows if you cross a body part, all bets are off, right? We understand that intuitively. Kids understand this. Grown-ups understand this. But the reality is, life requires truth. Because any society, any culture where truth is not told, even most of the time, it would just be impossible to live in that kind of a world. There are certain questions. I mean, all truth may be relative. Some people say that, kind of thing. But there are certain truths that we don't want to be relative. How much money is in my bank account? You don't want the bank to say, well, from our perspective, it looks like... You want them to say how much money is in the bank account. Is that hot? I want the truth on that. I don't want, well, hot for me is not hot for, there's got to be some external standard that we can appeal to. Because otherwise, it's just impossible to live. And here's the brokenness about us is I want other people to be truthful with me, but I want to look for loopholes when it comes to the way I talk to them. See, I get angry when they don't tell me the truth, but when they ask me a question, I start thinking through, what can I say that won't technically be a lie? And I try to spin it, I try to shape it, fudge a little bit here and there, manipulate, and I use my words to deceive. And that's just the truth about us. We look for loopholes, especially when the question is, does this make me look fat? Then you want to know that there's a way out of this. But Jesus says, life here consists of looking for loopholes. And if I swear by God, then I have to keep that promise. But if I swear by God's house, then that's not really as binding. And if I swear by God's garage, then that's not as binding as God's house. See, there are degrees of being bound to my word. And Jesus says that's the way life is like here. But there's a whole different kind of life available to us now. And you don't have to live like that anymore. That's why he starts by saying, you have heard this, but I tell you that. You have heard, if you swear by this, that's not really binding, but if you swear by that, then it is. And I'm telling you, don't make oaths at all. Don't be that kind of person. They had their loopholes. They had their version of crossed fingers. And Jesus says, that's absurd. Stop doing that. Keep your finger here at Matthew 5 and flip over to Matthew 23. You can see there's another illustration of this. Jesus is talking to them in Matthew 23. And he starts in verse 16. And he says, woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, that means nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But whoever swears by the gift on the altar is bound by the oath. You see how meticulous they'd gotten? There were rules here that they had to think through. Well, this is binding and that's not. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. In other words, just stop looking for loopholes altogether. It's pointless, it's foolish, it's absurd. Stop doing it. And if you tie that back to what we just read in Matthew 5, he says, listen, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And you shouldn't need anything more than that. You only need that. You only need to go through all these hoops and jump through all this kind of stuff if you've given people a reason to doubt your word. But you shouldn't need all those things. You shouldn't have to say, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. You shouldn't have to swear on a Bible 3 times. You shouldn't have to swear on your mother's grave or your grandfather's eye teeth or whatever it is that we swear by. You shouldn't have to do any of that. You should be the kind of person who, when you say yes, people know. His yes means yes. And your no means no. Jesus says, don't spin it, don't shade it, don't manipulate it. You just tell reality as you know it. He's not saying if you get summoned and have to go to court, you can't swear on the Bible. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying if somebody says, I swear to God or something, that's like the unpardonable sin. That's not what he's getting at here. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying you shouldn't be the kind of person who needs to do that before others will take you seriously. Because Jesus is always after what kind of person you're becoming. And unfortunately, not only do we find that we are addicted to deception, but what we find is that in trying to overcome the deceptiveness that is resident within us, we swap that addiction for another, and what we become addicted to on the other end is rules. Constantly looking for a rule. How much truth do I have to tell? And in which circumstances do I have to tell the truth? Do I always have to tell every piece of the truth that I know? Do I have to tell all of the truth all of the time? Do I have to, what is the rule? What's the law? Let me go to the rule book here and see what the rules of the road have to say for this. And Jesus says, that's not what I'm after either. I'm after what's going on inside of you and what kind of person you're becoming. Because when you look for rules, what you end up doing is 2 things. You end up neglecting your own heart, and you end up looking for loopholes. And it's the legalists that I find are the most likely to say things like, well, technically it wasn't a lie because I didn't say that I always am going to. It's always the legalists who are looking for those kinds of loopholes. There's a guy named Stephen Mansfield who is an author and a speaker. He lives up in Nashville, and he told a story once, and I don't know if this is actually true, but as far as I know this is true, about his roommate in college. He went to a Christian college in Oklahoma, and his roommate in college hung a sign over his bed in the dorm room. The Word is what it said. And he sort of nicknamed his bed The Word. And Stephen couldn't figure that out. Why in the world would you nickname your bed The Word? Well, it turns out that not too long into the semester, his roommate was late for a class. He had an early morning, Monday morning, 8 o'clock class, and he was late for it. And he went to his professor and said, I'm sorry I was late. I spent a lot of time in the Word this morning. I don't know that that's true, but as far as I know, that's true. It's always the legalists who are looking for things like that to do. And so Jesus comes along and he says, look, just stop it. Just stop doing that. It's ridiculous. Underneath all of these attempts to deceive, underneath lying is the intent to deceive people. And that's what Jesus is getting at. Not, well, technically, my words didn't say that. What was your intent? Was your intent to deceive? Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9 says this about the human heart. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? Now, that's not the whole truth about the human heart. The human heart is capable of lots of other things. The human heart is capable of warmth and compassion and understanding. That's not the whole truth about my heart or your heart, but it is the truth about our hearts. No one teaches kids to lie. Kids figure it out on their own. Nobody teaches kids how to tell half-truths. They figure it out, don't they? We use our words. Sometimes, in an effort to avoid lying outright, we'll use our silence. We'll use our facial expressions. We'll use our tone of voice, our gestures. We'll shrug. We've come up with all sorts of ways to deceive people. We are masters of deception, of deceiving people without actually lying to them. And then we think with a clear conscience, well, I didn't lie to them. And Jesus is saying, I'm going after something so much deeper, so much bigger than that. This deception is so pervasive, and it's just deep down inside of us. And it especially comes out in the way we use our words. And so often our words are used to manipulate other people. You start paying attention, especially watch the media at the way they use words to finesse or persuade or manipulate other people. It's just a way of life. And I'm going to say something, and I know there are a lot of men in this room, and might land on you, but a lot of the sales tactics that are taught to guys who are in sales come down to how can you manipulate the other person without actually lying to them. And Jesus says that's not what life in God's kingdom is like. A lot of times women will use their words to manipulate their husbands or their kids. And they won't actually technically lie to them, but they'll use tone of voice, they'll use what they say or what they don't say to try to manipulate or coerce the people around them. And Jesus says that's not what life in God's kingdom is like. Jesus says just stop it. Stop trying to control others and just tell the truth. And a great wave of anxiety swept across the room. Because when that happens, if that's the case, then, well, John, how do I get him to do what I want him to do? Well, the short answer to that is you don't. That's not your job. That's not why God put you here, to manipulate them and get them to do what you want them to do. That's not your objective. Your objective is to live a life characterized by truth as you become increasingly transformed from within into the kind of person whose yes means yes and no means no. But I don't like that. Well, you don't have to like it. And in the final analysis, what it comes down to is trust. What do you trust more? Do you trust that God has your best interest at stake more than you trust your own ability to get what you want? Which of those do you trust more? Do you trust the power of truth? Because truth has its own power resident within it. Power to liberate people who are held captive. Do you trust that? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the power of making a decision and how a lot of people have decided to trust Jesus with what happens to them after they die, but very few of us have decided to trust Him with what happens to us between now and then. There's power in a decision, and some of you just need to decide tonight to stop it, to stop deceiving others, to stop manipulating others, to stop using your words to coerce and spin and shade and fudge and try to get what you want. And you just need to decide once and for all, I'm going to stop it. Because the truth is, in our world, you will never drift into being a more truth-filled person. It doesn't happen by default. Because our society has gone so far down the path of deception. You'll never just wake up one morning and find, you know what, I don't lie anymore. It will require a conscious decision. It's so deeply embedded in our culture. Do you know the most popular story about truth-telling in America? Anybody think of the most popular, the greatest example of all time is George Washington chopped down the cherry tree. You guys understand this. His dad is gone. George Washington chops down the cherry tree, and his dad shows up and says, "Who chopped down the cherry tree?" George Washington looks at him and says, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." Do you know that story is made up? Didn't actually happen. The whole story is a lie. Parson Weems, the guy who wrote the biography of George Washington, made that story, completely fabricated it. The most famous story about honesty and truth-telling, a complete fabrication. That's how deeply embedded it is in our society. Now, let me ask you a question. He wrote that book in the early 19th century. Has the level of truth-telling in our society gone up or down since the early 19th century? This is a general rule, especially as it relates to government officials. Because some of you remember back in 1960, you remember in 1960? Dwight Eisenhower's in the White House. He's a national hero. He's a war hero, heavily decorated. And he gets on national television. He tells everybody there are no airplanes, no American spy planes over Russia. And then they show him a picture of a U-2 spy plane that had been forced down in Russia. And America had to come to grips with the fact that one of its national heroes had lied to the American public. Nowadays, that doesn't even shock us at all. But back then, that was a big, big deal. And you remember back in Vietnam, when we were told there is no bombing going on in Southeast Asia right now. And then there's film footage that they come up with of bombing, American soldiers bombing in Vietnam. And again, and back in the 60s, there came to be known as a credibility gap. That phrase had never been used before. But now all of a sudden, that's what we're really concerned with, the credibility gap. And in 1970s, I can remember Ronald Ziegler was Richard Nixon's press secretary, remember? And during the Watergate scandal, Ronald Ziegler gets on national television and he tells a whopper. He tells a big, giant, bold-faced lie. I never understood what bald-faced means, but apparently a clean-shaven lie and no hair on the face of that lie. And he tells this lie, and then he gets caught. And it's revealed that it's just a big, fat lie. And he goes on television the next day, and this is what he says: "The statement I made yesterday is now inoperative." Inoperative. Try that one sometime at work. "I know that I said I was going to have the report done today, but that statement is now inoperative." "Honey, I know I said last night I was going to do the dishes, but that statement is now inoperative." "I know I promised that I would pay my mortgage payment by the 15th, but that statement is now inoperative." That never works anywhere. Politics is now, we've gotten to the point where politics is no longer built on truth or falsity, but on credibility. How can I get people to believe what I'm saying so they will do what I want them to do? That's what politics largely is based on. So I have to look credible. I have to dress credible. I have to have the credible voice and use credible words. And nobody cares whether it's true or false. Does it sound true? That's what we're concerned with. We're so concerned with other people's perceptions of us. I remember several years ago, Jerry Springer announced he was going to do a show on compulsive liars. And my first thought was, how will that show be much different from any other show he ever does? That's all his shows are. Could you imagine the kind of ratings you would get if you said, all week long there's going to be nothing but compulsive liars on television? That's every week. Every single week. It's nothing but, the other thing that I found that was really funny is about that time is when a little scandal kind of erupted over these Jerry Springer guests who were going on the show and they didn't really have the problems that they said they were going to have. And then I thought, if you go on a show and claim to be a compulsive liar, but you're actually not, what does that make you? The truth is, you will not drift into honesty, and we have to make a decision. It requires a decision. And so people sometimes will say, all right, how do I do it? I'm going to give you a piece of advice, and you can do with this whatever you like. You can take this advice or you can throw it out. But the best advice I can give you, if you want to become a more truth-filled, less deceptive person, the best advice I can give you is talk less. This is the way the writer of Proverbs puts it. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19, when words are many, sin is not absent. You want to lower your sin quotient per day? Talk less. I think that could actually be beneficial. Talk less. James says we should be slow to speak and quick to listen. And if we listened more, we'd probably find ourselves telling fewer lies. Now, some of you grew up and you saw sort of in your home, truth was not held at a premium. You grew up and you saw your parents, you'd answer the phone during dinner and hey, it's your boss or something like that. Tell them I'm not here. And they would actually have you lie for them. Tell them I'm not here. Or you don't tell your father about this. That's another big one. Don't tell your father. Some of you, you hung out with people and cheating just happened. Everybody cheated, and you just sort of absorbed that by osmosis. One of the most dangerous things about parenting is you get to set the definition of the word normal for your kids. And if lying happens frequently in your home, that's normal for them now. You get to determine what's normal in terms of the way we deal with truth and falsehood. For a lot of us, we just sort of breathed that atmosphere in. And you wonder why in the world you struggle with relationships. But here's just a principle that you can take to the bank. When you plant deception, you reap alienation. Because deceit is always anti-community. But Jesus says there's another way to live. He says there's another way, and then he comes and actually lives it out. Look in John chapter 1 and see the way it describes. John, who knew Jesus very, very well, at the beginning of his biography, says this about Jesus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He was full of it. Sometimes we use that expression, but we don't mean truth. Full of it. You're full of it. John looks at Jesus and he says he was full of it. He's full of truth. Everywhere he went, truth just oozed out of him. And here's how you know what's really inside you. When you get squeezed by the world, what comes out of you is what's really in you. A lot of times we get jostled or bumped or poked by the world and we say, look what you made me do, look what you made me say. No, that person didn't make you, that was in there. Jesus got squeezed by the world, got punched, poked, prodded, and what came out of him was grace and truth, because that's what was in him. And so for some of you, the best thing you can do is you can just say, that's it, I'm done, I'm not going to lie anymore. And you need to ask somebody in your small group to hold you accountable to that. Or you need to find some of the elders of this church and you just need to go to them and you just need to say, I'm done. I'm done lying and I need you to pray for me. But most of us think, lying is bad and it's wrong and all that kind of stuff, but it's still a nice option to have tucked in your back pocket. You will use it as a last resort, but it's good to have in there. A lot of us, our theology of lying is like, and I've told this story before about the preacher who was preaching one Sunday and the 2 pages of his Bible was stuck together. He was in a Psalms, and he reads the first part of a psalm, and it says, a lie is an abomination to the Lord. And then he turns the page, and because his pages are stuck together, this is what he gets, and a very present help in time of need. And for a lot of us, that's our theology of lying. We know it's bad, we know it's wrong, but just in case, it's good to have that tucked away in my back pocket, like that $20 bill that I think I'm never going to use that I have stuck in the folds of my wallet. Just in case. I'd like to be able to pull this out if I need it. You just need to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Now, you need to know, when you say this, it's going to cost you something. It will probably be painful. But it will be worth it. Because this is your chance to grow and become more like Jesus. So, okay, and I'm trying to rush to get through. I told you last week we were going to do this periodically. I have a pop quiz for you, okay? Oh, you sound so excited about this. I have a pop quiz for you, okay? All right, you ready for your pop quiz? Here you go. Somebody asks you to do them a favor. What do? 1, you tell them a bald-faced lie. You go and you shave and you tell them a lie. And because you're under grace, right? You're not under law, so you don't have to. Is that what you do? 2, you say yes and you shake your head no. And that confuses them, and then you can run away. Or 3, you tell them you have no intention of doing what they ask. You tell them you resent them asking for a favor. You tell them their breath stinks and they need help from the people on what not to wear to help them with their wardrobe choices. You dump an entire truckload of truth on them. You tell them everything, the whole truth, the ugly truth, the bad truth. You tell them, even you want truth, I got your truth right here. Which of those do you do? Answer, none of the above. You pause and you reflect on your natural impulse. And you refuse to answer out of fear of what the other person's going to think. You use wisdom and tact to respond as honestly as you can in love. And that's an important phrase right there at the end. You use grace, wisdom, tact, and love. In Psalm 101, verse 7, this is what the psalmist says. No one who practices deceit will dwell in my house. No one who speaks falsely will stand in my presence. And can you imagine what it would look like for a group of people to say, not in this house? No more deception, no more half-truths, no more spin, no more hype, no more lies, not in this house. In this house, we tell the truth. We tell the truth, and we do it in love. We use grace and wisdom and tact. Can you imagine what a group of people who are committed to being bearers of truth would look like? Because the truth is, in God's house, truth reigns. And if you're not full of truth, you won't be comfortable here. And the reason is because truth is a reflection of God's character. And when you lie, something happens to your heart. And it becomes easier the next time to tell another lie and another one and another one. And eventually your conscience never bothers you. But what is God's dream from the very beginning? What has God been building for thousands of years? He's been building a community, a city set on a hill, a light that couldn't be hidden. And community is built on relationships, and relationships are built on trust, and trust is built on truth. And every time you spin and fudge and tell a half-truth and deceive, you create a community where it's a little bit harder to experience what God's goal is. And you end up working against God's purposes. Jesus says truth isn't about rules or about laws. It's about the kind of community we're building. And one more thing, not just what we say. God's not just concerned with what we say. God is concerned with how we say it. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, the Apostle Paul says this, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into Him who is the head, that is Christ. That's God's goal for us, is that we'll grow up and be like Jesus. This is the way we do it, by speaking the truth in love. The Greek phrase there is actually could be translated truthing in love. Truthing in love. And I know a lot of people, and you use truth as a weapon. And some of the most honest people I've ever met in my life are also some of the meanest people. And God says, not in this house. In this house, truth is told, but it is told in love. Brutal honesty is not the way of God's kingdom. Truth without love is ungodly, just as love without truth is unimaginable. Now, this week, you're going to have situations. You're going to have things come up. You're going to have opportunities where you could tell a lie, you could spin a story, you could do something to shade it, and you're going to say, here's my chance. Here's my chance to live this new kind of life that Jesus promised I could live. You're going to have the opportunity. You're going to be running late, and you're going to be tempted to cover it up, but you're going to say, here's my chance. That's what you're going to say. You're going to say, so sometime this week you're going to forget to follow through on something. You're going to be tempted to blame somebody else. It wasn't my fault. It was that person's fault, or it was the computer, or I ran out of ink, or I didn't get your email. But instead of doing that, you're going to say, this week you're going to have the opportunity to tell a story and to change the details in such a way that it makes you look like a hero, more of a hero than you actually were. But instead of doing that, you're going to say, this week your spouse is going to ask you, does this outfit make me look fat? And you're going to say, no, you're going to look for a loophole and you're going to cross your fingers. That's what you're going to do. Now listen. All right, this is going to be hard. I don't want to pretend. I'm not selling you anything except books. This is going to be hard. And it's going to cost you pain. Because our world does not value truth tellers. The greatest truth teller of all time, the one who came and said, not only do I tell the truth, but I am the truth, got nailed to a cross for his trouble. And he said, listen, if you think they were hard on me, don't be surprised when they're hard on you. This is not going to be easy, but the promise of God is it will be worth it, because you're forming inside the kind of heart and the kind of character that will not only obey, but will obey with joy. For the joy set before him, Jesus gladly, willingly endured whatever shame, whatever scorn, whatever this world could heap upon him. He said, bring it on, because you don't understand how great what I have waiting for me is. can you imagine what a group of people who gathered together and said, we value honesty, we value truth when it is told in the context of love, and we value truth tellers. How amazingly captivating that group of people would be. How magnetically people would be drawn to that kind of community. And Jesus promised us, when you lift me up, and I am the truth, when you lift me up, I will draw people from all walks of life. And that really can happen here. Let's pray. God, you came to this earth and you didn't just tell the truth. You weren't just full of truth. You were truth personified. And that's what we want to be as well. We want to be a people who are characterized by truth. We want to be a people who value and honor truth tellers. And we want to be a people who say, blessed is the man who keeps his oath even when it causes him pain. May that be said of us as we engage in this process of being transformed from within into the image of Jesus. That's our prayer tonight. In his name, amen. We'll see you next week.